Okay, well, good morning to everyone that's here. Thank you for joining. It's maybe a little different picture than you're used to seeing because I had some technical problems with using my webcam, and so I'm using my iPhone, but noticing as some of you have pointed out that it's a little out of focus, but um, you know, I really don't know why. I wish I did, but I think one of the things that I have to do is I probably have to upgrade our internet provider here because I think it's one of the limiting things here is that we don't have a fast enough internet connection. But in any case, we'll just go with the flow, as we say, and we'll just make the best of it. But I wanted to thank all of you for joining us again, and I think I heard a little bit of the Coffee and Dharma. I wasn't eavesdropping, but since my wife was participating in the kitchen, I couldn't help but hear a little bit of it. But I think people are talking in general. A lot of people are discussing the coronavirus pandemic and the difficult challenges that we're all facing. And it's very hard, but as our public officials keep repeating to us, that we all need to, stay at home and stay safe. But of course, the stay-at-home restrictions are, and the mandatory closures are making many people's lives really difficult. But the other thing, that I think, I've been hearing a lot is that these stay-at-home rules and mandatory closures are in place to, basically to expedite as much as possible, us getting back to normal. And with this particular coronavirus still being quite, contagious, it's really clear because of the interdependence that we all have, that we really are, all in this pandemic together. And so, how quickly we can get to the other side of the pandemic depends on us all staying at home as much as possible, and practicing social distancing. So that's my sort of sermon, my moralistic sermon for this morning. But I hope that in the not too distant future that we can get back to normal. And actually, that's what I'm kind of talking about today. So we are experiencing many difficulties with these stay-at-home mandates, and I'm sure you would agree with that. But I think along with the difficulties, aren't there in fact some ways in which staying at home has been maybe beneficial for you? Because like for me personally, because of my live streaming these services from home, one of the challenges that I faced was finding a way to incorporate, the music for our closing gatha, which, as you know, is Ondokusan 2. When we sing this song at temple, we have that big organ sound provided by Mrs. Funai, right? And I kind of think of that big sound in the hondo as a kind of other power, that pushes me to get those high notes out. I mean, it's a difficult song, whether it's the minor version, the Ondokusan 1 or Ondokusan 2. It's hard to get those notes out, but when that organ sound is there pushing me, I can do it. But in this very different, intimate setting of live streaming from my home, I felt like I needed to create a different version of Ondokusan. Of course, I don't have an organ here, so I had to create a different version. And I played it last week, and I'll play it again today at the end of this service. And so this is kind of like the sort of silver lining that I'm kind of referring to. So in creating this new version, I got involved, not surprisingly, in looking at Ondokusan again and looking at its lyrics in particular. And then my appreciation for the message in the song, I think, has been deepened by that. And so, even though it's difficult to deal with the temple being, shut down, this difficulty has, in a sense, provided me this opportunity to, discover or maybe rediscover, the deep meaning in Ondokusan. And this is what I wanted to share with you today. And one of the things is, I hope that you might find this topic of the meaning in the lyrics of Ondokusan relevant to you. And basically the reason is that when our lives used to be normal, which I guess was about 5 or 6 weeks ago. Probably like me, your daily routine was filled with all kinds of responsibilities and deadlines and meetings and errands and so forth. But like in my case, when the temple was officially shut down, my calendar suddenly became full of crossed out items. Of course, other things then became priorities, such as learning how to live stream. Well, first of all, learning what live streaming was, 'cause I really had heard about it, but I didn't know what it was, much less how to do it. And I talked about that a little last week. But so other priorities kind of filled the place. But still, I did in fact have more time, or some time to reflect on basically, the essential question I think that we all think about when we reflect on, when we have the time to reflect is, where am I in my life right now? So have you also found yourself being a little more reflective lately? I think we're all in one way or another in a more kind of introspective mood or mode lately, and I think this is something that's brought on, of course, by the coronavirus pandemic, or as we would say, by the reality of unexpected change, by the reality of impermanence. And then, what we ask ourselves when we do reflect on our lives in this way is something along the lines of, am I where I want to be right now in my life? Am I really where I want to be right now in my life? And it's actually, if I didn't suspect that we'd get into copyright trouble with Facebook, I'd play right now for you a song that comes into my mind, which is the song that made the late Kenny Rogers famous, which was, "I just dropped in to see what condition my condition was in." Yeah, oh yeah. Do you remember that? Hopefully that's not a copyright violation right there, that chorus line. But I'm sure those of you that are of my generation remember that song. Those of you that are not are going, what the heck is he talking about? But anyway, it's a great song because it references this idea of finding oneself in a certain point in their life or a certain state of mind when this sort of self-reflection sort of happens. And oftentimes it's brought on by the experience of difficulty, of course. But I also remember the Dalai Lama once putting it very clearly. One of the famous quotes from the Dalai Lama is, quote, "The purpose of our lives is to be happy." No wonder he sells millions of books, right? But he's right, and moreover, I think the ultimate benefit of the Buddha's teaching is, in fact, to guide us to finding true happiness in our lives. But then you might be thinking, well, what does all that have to do with Ondokusan? But actually, I think Ondokusan provides, insightful guidance on how to achieve that true happiness in our lives. But bear with me a little bit, because in order to recognize the deep insight that's provided in just the 4 short lines of Ondokusan, I need to share with you some very helpful ideas from one of Dr. Nobuo Hanada's essays, because there's an essay in which he discusses what happiness means in Buddhism. And Hanada Sensei begins in this essay by quoting the very famous words of the Zen master Dogen. I'm sure most of you have heard this quote before. Hanada Sensei says that this quote from Dogen is probably the best definition of human happiness and the best definition of Buddhism. And so the quote is, "Studying Buddhism means studying the self. Studying the self means forgetting the self. Forgetting the self means being attained by the spirit that is one with tens of thousands of things." I'll read that one more time. Studying Buddhism means studying the self. Studying the self means forgetting the self. Forgetting the self means being attained by the spirit that is one with tens of thousands of things. And so in his essay, Dr. Netta clarifies that first sentence, studying Buddhism means studying the self, defines Buddhism as purely being a matter of self-examination. But he's, in essence, is very quick to point out that what self-examination means in Buddhism. Now, when I first, read this, maybe you also agree, this is a little disturbing, because what self-examination does not mean is it does not mean pursuing our personal individual happiness. According to Haneda Sensei, if we think that way, all we do is deepen our self-love and our self-centeredness. Self-examination is indeed the key to finding true happiness, but self-examination in Buddhism means honestly and completely examining the self, seeing the self as it really is, not as we like to think it is. Which means that normally when we examine the self, we only acknowledge our good qualities, right? And we tend to easily find the faults of others. This is not Buddhist self-examination, because as Dr. Netta points out, in true Buddhist self-examination, we discover that the self is nothing worth loving. We discover that the self is nothing worth cherishing. And thinking this way, we become less self-attached, less self-centered. But then Dr. Netta clarifies what is, I think, the truly, I would say, radical implication here. Because Dogen himself states, the next sentence, studying the self means forgetting the self. So as Haneda Sensei clarifies, what this means is that true Buddhist self-examination ends up with us discovering this so-called self of ours as something worth forgetting. Now, why is forgetting the self the key to true happiness? In my interpretation, it's because, to put it in other words, to the extent that we are attached to our so-called self or our ego identity, to the extent that we're attached to that, we will also be limited by it. We will be unable to fully appreciate the totality of life. We cannot become, quote, one with the tens of thousands of things, which is mentioned in Dogen's passage. But then Haneda Sensei also asks really what is probably the key question here. He asks, if forgetting the self is the key to happiness, how can we forget the self? So actually, of course, the self cannot forget the self. The unawakened ego self cannot awaken itself. So the answer, as Dr. Netta puts it, is that, quote, we must meet something powerful and overwhelming. But what is powerful and overwhelming in Buddhism? It is the spirit of the Bodhisattva. Nothing else can make us forget the self. When Dogen says forgetting the self means being attained by the spirit that is one with tens of thousands of things, he means that the self should meet the spirit of the Bodhisattva and be replaced by it. I think Dr. Netta is explaining here that this Bodhisattva spirit is the spirit that's basically forgotten the issue of its own happiness and instead is concerned with the happiness of all beings. This is the Bodhisattva spirit. And I think in our Shin Buddhist tradition, this Bodhisattva spirit is also referred to as, in the Japanese word, is Hongan, or innermost aspiration. And so, as Haneda Sensei is clarifying here, this Bodhisattva spirit, this self-forgetting spirit, is powerful. Only when we meet the spirit and become overwhelmed and permeated by it can we forget ourselves and discover true happiness. We usually do not think it's possible to identify with such a noble spirit, but when we actually meet a person who possesses the powerful Bodhisattva spirit and become overwhelmed by it, we can experience a spiritual transformation and forget the self. And then finally, Haneda Sensei concludes his essay by saying, "So long as we seek our own happiness, we will never be able to attain it. But when we meet the Bodhisattva Spirit, when we can forget our own happiness, this self-forgetfulness is actually the experience of our true happiness. This true happiness must be realized from the side of the Buddha, from the side of the Dharma, without any recourse to our own abilities." And so I think many of you might know in Dr. Haneda's case that an example of his discovering this true happiness was realized when he was inspired in this exact same way by meeting his own teacher, the teacher Shuichi Maeda. And I personally think that this noble spirit that Haneda Sensei describes is, in fact, given moving expression in the Gatha that we sing, that we've been singing to close our services. So that's very convenient, right? And so what I'm referring to is, of course, Ondokusan. And if it's true and lasting happiness that we seek, then I think Ondokusan does point the way to it. Now, on the one hand, this idea of noble spirit that is expressed in Ondokusan, that Dr. Haneda has been talking about, we could think of it as the spirit of Shinran, right? Because he's the composer of Ondokusan. Ondokusan comes from one of his wasans, and it's natural to think that the spirit, this Bodhisattva spirit that's expressed in Ondokusan, is really reflecting Shinran's spirit. But I don't think that's really what Shinran had in mind, actually. That's a very narrow view of it. I think what Shinran was expressing was the universal aspiration that's deep within all of us. He's expressing the Bodhisattva spirit that energized his life and that absolutely can also energize our lives. If you look at the lyrics of Ondokusan too, I don't know, hopefully some of you may have downloaded, but those of you that are Higashi regulars, you probably know these words by heart. This is the English translation of Ondokusan. Embraced by Amida's great compassion, I respond with gratitude, dedicating my life. Embraced by my dear teachers and dear Dharma friends, I must answer gratefully throughout my life. I think you can, clearly see this Bodhisattva spirit, this, compassionate Bodhisattva spirit in the words, I respond with gratitude, dedicating my life, and, I must answer gratefully throughout my life. Responding with gratitude and answering gratefully describe the life of a person dedicated to sincerely listening the Buddha's teaching and then working energetically and selflessly to share it with others throughout their life. But then also the words embraced by Amida's great compassion and embraced by my dear teachers and dear Dharma friends. I think that this verb embraced clarifies that the energy and the inspiration of these efforts arises naturally because of my having received, through my encounters with the reality of impermanence, through my encounters with the reality of the interdependence of all life, and through all of my teachers and all of my Dharma friends. Through all of these encounters, having received the precious wisdom of the Buddha's teaching. I think this is what Haneda Sensei means when he says that this Bodhisattva spirit, this true happiness, is only realized from the side of the Buddha Dharma, from the reality of our life's experiences and from our opportunity to hear the teaching through our teachers. And so to conclude my talk today, I'd like you to please join me in singing Ondokusan 2. Let me see here. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. So I hope you can appreciate, a little bit more why this song, Ondokusan, holds, such a central place in our Jodo Shinchi tradition. It's not simply something that we're required to sing in our tradition. I think that's maybe the feeling that some people have. And it's not something we sing just to honor Shinran Shonin. It's actually describing the way of the Bodhisattva, the way of self-forgetfulness, which is the way to discovering, our true happiness. And so, in closing, I'm sure you agree with me that when we finally do resume services, at the temple, I very much look forward to hearing, Mrs. Funai's big organ sound, which will no doubt help us all remember the deep significance of Ondokusan. So thank you very much for listening. Please join me in Gaisho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.